right. Thank you everyone for coming to our webinar today. 3 conversations around consent we are not having, but must. My name is Sasha Goodfriend, and I'm the state president of Massachusetts now, and am really grateful to be here in community with all of you online today from all over the country: Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, California, Florida, Massachusetts, Oregon. I'm sure there's more, Australia. This is the 7th webinar in a series that started since the pandemic to bring now together from all over the country and talk and learn about our priority issue areas, how they're being impacted during the pandemic, and how we can all take action in our respective states and countries on our feminist agenda. So thank you for being here. Before we get into the webinar, I want to acknowledge the moment that we're in regards to having rightful protests all around the country to respond to the racial violence that we've been seeing since our country started, from including police brutality and the murders of George Floyd and Breonna and the countless other Black and brown victims to police brutality. So we have to acknowledge that today, and until there is justice. And I want to acknowledge that it's not okay. We're not continuing our work business as usual. And as a white leader of my state organization, and to all the other white allies on this call, I want to specifically acknowledge our role in reminding ourselves even more how we need to center racial justice in our work. So I want to say that first and foremost. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. McGuire, who's going to lead us in a grounding exercise, which I've been finding helpful as we all are having so many crises going on right now before we get started. And actually, one more thing before I hand it over to Dr. McGuire for the grounding exercise and to get started with this webinar. I also want to do a land acknowledgement, which we haven't done before on these webinars, but is a great idea from Dr. McGuire. So in Massachusetts, I want to acknowledge that this is the land of the Wampanoag tribes. And if you don't know the tribes that were where you are right now, then maybe that's something that you can Google and look up as well. Also, I just want to say, for other folks who've been joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat box with your name, pronouns, and where you are. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. McGuire. Thank you.
Yay! This is so amazing. I can't believe we have people from all over the world. I've done a lot of webinars. I don't think I've ever had such a global audience at one. So I think that is a really good sign. Thank you for everybody who is taking their time out of their day from wherever they are to join us in this really important conversation. So as Sasha said, we're gonna start with a grounding exercise, and just take a second, because again, you're probably logging off of stuff. You've had a busy work day, it's the middle of the week, and our brains are in a million places. And so it's just really good to take a second and breathe. So let's breathe together, inhaling and exhaling. Again, inhaling and exhaling. Relax your jaw, relax your shoulders. And just, again, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking this moment of your time. I also, in being present, strongly encourage people, especially with webinars, because you're going to get pop-ups on your screen and, you know, this email just came in, this text just came in. Try to silence that, right? Try to not be checking all of the other things that are always distracting us in our technological world. And, you know, it's just an hour and a half of your day. So let's try to be fully present with each other. And of course, allow for the reality that sometimes that is impossible, but we try. I will share my screen with you now. And, oh, let's see. I think you have to, give me the permission. Yay, now I can do it. All right. And let me know if you can't see something, but we should be good to go. All right, so as you all know, today's conversation is huge. Let me just say that up front, right? This is not, we're gonna kind of go wide instead of deep on a lot of these things. So I want to acknowledge up front that these are huge topics, each of these conversations that we aren't having about consent. Each of them are their own area of scholarship. Each of them could be their own multiple-hour talk, right? So a lot of times, I've given this talk before when people come, they're like, oh my gosh, can you tell me a lot more about XYZ? Yes, and I'll have my contact information at the end for people who wanna stay in touch or even have like a conversation for their community about just one of these topics. But I think it's good that we just introduce some of the things that I know, again, from my research and from my practice in academia, but I see in the conversations around consent and bodily autonomy and the intersections in that with everything from ethnic and racial erasure to queer exclusion, right? There's just so many different areas that we don't touch on yet. And so that's the exciting thing, is that we get to engage with that and learn how we can do better. So once again, I'm Dr. Laura McGuire, and you can find me through the National Center for Equity and Agency. And that is our consulting firm, myself and some other social scientists that I work with. So let's get started. There's always some like technological thing. We're like, okay, let's figure it out. All right, so who am I? Obviously, you know my name, and some of you read my beautiful bio I saw in the link to this webinar, but just a quick overview of who I am and why I should be talking about this at all. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm okay with she, her as well. I prefer they, them. I am an educator, so I started out as a teacher. I worked with at-risk teens, in particular teen girls. And my first job ever was actually in a one-room schoolhouse for teen mothers. Those still exist. And it was quite an education. And then I started working with girls who were in and out of the juvenile justice system. And where that really led me was to have this deep passion and focus on both trauma and inclusion, and diversity and inclusion, equity, all of those components of that piece of the conversation. Because I saw my students' experiences, and I saw how divorced they were from what most education, what most curriculums were including. I was really passionate about health education and sexual education, and again, didn't see their realities reflected in that, right? Because a lot of people would think middle school and high school, young people have maybe certain privileges from being not exposed to certain things, but for my students, they had been exposed to a lot already in their life. And so they were developing as human beings and trying to figure out who they were through the lens of complex and compound trauma, historical trauma, communal trauma, right? All these different traumatic experiences, which were giving them a very different perspective on adolescence than some of their peers. And so that's where I really was like, I want to amplify their voices, and I want to do that through being somebody who produces research that highlights their experiences and then goes out and advocates with that privilege, because having higher education is a huge privilege and gives us a huge platform to educate the world about those students' experiences. And so I went on to grad school, and that's what I studied for my doctorate. I studied inclusion with a focus on LGBTQ competency and sexual trauma prevention and response in sexual health education. And so that's where my foundation in academia really is in the perspective of sexology. and I am certified through the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, a long name, AASECT, as some of you know it. And I am also one of the committee members, former chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for AASECT. So again, sexology, a lot of people think, is that a real field? Yes, I'm not making it up. It's real. We have conferences, we have certifications, we exist, but we're small. And I think that we come with a very unique lens and framework to understanding sexual violence, to understanding consent. We really are the field that studied it first, both cross-culturally and historically. And that's fascinating, right? So we see the world, we see even in legal fields, where they're now suddenly really on board with affirmative consent, and seeing other communities try to understand it, maybe not knowing the full context of some of how those conversations even got started in its history, certain pieces end up being left out. And so that's, again, one of my focuses, is trying to broaden that conversation and understanding. I am an inclusion and sexual trauma prevention expert. So as a consultant, that's what I've done for higher ed. That's what I've done for K-12. And then I even did it for a while for the government. And I am a full spectrum doula, which means that on top of all of this, in my free time, I really focus a lot on reproductive justice as well. And again, looking at how do we serve people in any aspect of reproductive health when they are, again, a survivor, they are LGBTQ, they come from another marginalized community of color, where in, again, reproductive health care, maybe their voice isn't often heard, or it's silenced or diminished. And so trying to change that for the better. So that's me. So I always tell people when they come to conferences and I'm speaking, I'm like, if you just wanted to come to a lecture where I talk at you and you get to like kind of zone out and take a little nap, please change rooms now. I warn them up front, because I'm like, I don't like talking at people. I don't even like the sound of my voice for that long, right? And so I try to make things very interactive. So on a webinar, it's a little trickier than if we were all in a room together right now, but we can still have some kind of dialogue in this component, right? So we'll go through the slides, we'll go through the discussion. Then at the end, we'll have at least 20 to 30 minutes of group discussion, where we go into those deeper questions that you have about what I've discussed. But still throughout, let's engage with each other. So the first thing I encourage you to do is to take a moment and look at these terms. So we have trauma, consent, rape culture, colonization, and restorative justice. Okay? So we have these terms, but what do they mean? Now, I want you to think about it, and I want you to write whatever answers you have in the chat box. And then Sasha, if you can read some of those for us when we get to the end of that, okay? So type away, share your thoughts. And I often tell people, you know, there's no right or wrong answer to this, right? Words are organic and fluid in our culture and personally as well, right? What trauma means to me or what colonization means to me is very different than what it means to someone else with different exposure, different life experience. And if you are an educator, because I know there's other educators on this call today, if you're an educator and you do workshops like this, I strongly encourage you to ask people what they think terms mean. Because too often we just throw around, you know, terminology and these concepts and we think, okay, everybody's on the same page as I am, but we don't really know where our audience is. They might already be pretty much subject matter experts on a lot of these topics themselves, and they have a lot to contribute from their own experiences. Or there's often terms that, you know, a large group of the audience has not heard before. And if I just keep going with it, they're not going to be able to understand exactly what I'm discussing. So I think it's important that we pause. And then also the next part of it that's really cool is you get to check in with yourself and say, what do I think of when these terms come up for me? And a lot of times we just haven't stopped to define it in our own worldview, right? Again, rape culture is something that a lot of people have heard, but a lot of people haven't heard. when we talk about trauma, you know, for somebody, they might think immediately physical trauma, and for other people, they think surviving any kind of abuse. For other people, they're thinking of in a larger communal context, right? And so it's important that, one, again, we know what each other's thinking. As educators, we understand where our audience is. And then for ourselves, that we stop and we think, what does this term bring up for me? All right, so Sasha, you have some definitions, I think, already.
Everyone is so good. There's so many different responses. Keep them coming. I see one from Karen, consent equals fries. I feel like that might be an acronym.
It is.
Michaela said, rape culture is an environment that normalizes sex abuse and sexual assault. Gabrielle, rape culture, the combination of assumptions and cultural norms that normalize sexual violence and harassment. Erin, consent is an enthusiastic yes to the prospect of sexual contact, touch, experiences. Kim says, trauma is an incident that scares you. Kathleen, rape culture is for me a system of values that reproduce and validates sexual violence. Keep them coming. I got a few more. From Ed, restorative justice heals the victim, community, and offender. Lauren, trauma, harm caused by some event which continues to impact someone's life. Kim, consent is clear communication that people are in agreement. Ronnie, affects ability to cope. Gabrielle, rape culture normalizing the sexual violence against folks. From Kathy, consent is agreement between partners regarding their physical and emotional relations. And then the last one for now, oh, good, keep them coming, is from Gabrielle, consent, no means no. Maybe means no. Yes can change to no and must be immediately respected. Yes means yes. Consent is freely given and enthusiastic permission for any physical contact in any area of your life, not just sexual. Consent is enthusiastic agreement to an activity, sexual or not. Rape culture are environments that support the normalization of sexual violence. From Karen, freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, specific. That sounds like it's in regards to consent. Ooh, and then the first one for colonization goes to Leska. Hopefully I said that right. Colonization, the process of domination over another people's and culture, and forcing the people to be a part of the dominating culture. And then Lauren from Canada said that colonization makes her think of stolen land.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everyone. That was awesome.
Very good answers. I love, again, how, you know, certain terms are really easy for certain audiences to define. We have a lot of people who strongly connect already with consent, which makes sense if you're coming to this webinar. But it's interesting, right, that one person had a really strong definition for restorative justice, which is awesome. I love that you already know what that is. There's a lot of misconceptions around what that looks like and, again, how it benefits victims and communities. And then colonization is hard for people to define, right? Especially because we exist in that system. And so it can be really challenging to think, well, what does that really mean in application? What does that mean in the way that I'm navigating the world? And what on earth does that have to do with consent? So we'll talk about that more. Great definitions. One of my favorite definitions for consent comes from one of my favorite books, and it's by Easton and Hardy, and they say that consent is an act of collaboration for the pleasure and well-being of all concerned. So let's just take that in for a second. Read it again. Consent is an act of collaboration for the pleasure and well-being of all concerned. right? And so we heard that in the definitions that the audience shared, right? That this is about sexuality, but this is also far outside of a bedroom or sexual contact. This has to do with emotional consent and emotional boundaries and, you know, any kind of physical contact as well, right? One of the things that a lot of times I'll hear from college students is they'll say, well, if I'm not having consent or if I'm not having sex, then I don't need consent. You know, this doesn't have to do with me because either, you know, for religious reasons, I'm abstinent, or, you know, that just hasn't come up in my life. And I often tell them, well, the reality is that consent is always coming up in your life. Anytime we interact with another human being, consent is either involved or not involved. And it's a life skill. Because again, if this is something that has to do with any person that we connect with, whether it's romantic or sexual or not at all, consent is something that we really want to internalize as a way that we approach the world, right? As a way that we think about the dignity of each human being. And also for ourselves, what we require for ourselves, that we have that active yes, that we also check in with ourselves, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but being able to reflect on our experiences with people and say, you know, is this something I really enthusiastically want? Or are there communal, societal, social pressures telling me I should say yes or no? And again, we'll get into discussion around that. But this is just such a beautiful definition. I think it's very holistic, and it's kind of the paradigm that I'm operating from mentally. So when we talk about looking at what society thinks about consent, we also have to look at the opposite of it, right? We have to say, what does society then think about sexual assault? And so these images are not graphic, but they're the top images that come up in Google Images when you type in sexual assault. And they are disturbing. So just an awareness piece there. And so I want you to look at them critically. And again, this is a moment we can do a quick check-in in the chat box of what do they have in common? What is the common message? And then once you've identified that mentally, who is being left out of these pictures?
Huh.
Okay. So look at all of those images. They actually have a lot of commonalities. And because they have a lot of commonalities, they're kind of telling one story. And if we tell one story, we end up leaving out a lot of realities because there's not one group or one scenario or, you know, one population that's being impacted by sexual violence. It's everybody. So look at those, and Sasha, again, you can read our chat box. What are some of the commonalities you're seeing? And then what is that making you realize about people who would not see their experience reflected in these most common images that we're using?
All right. We have from Lauren, white women as victims. Maybe victims isn't the right word, she says.
Yeah.
Audrey, male victims are not being included in the imagery. From Lauren, male perpetrators. Nicole, that women are weak and helpless. From Gabrielle, implies all sexual violence involves a physical violence. Karen says older people. Kim says young. Lauren says also young, white, able-bodied women. Kathleen says physical and sexual violence. And then Dee says fear.
Mm-hmm. All right. So yes, those are some of our main points. And smart people we have tuning in today because you guys got it. Right. It is kind of this, again, one perspective. And it's not that these aren't valid experiences or that this isn't what many experiences look like. But if we think that this is all the experiences when we talk about sexual violence and what we're trying to eradicate by creating a consent culture, then we're doing a huge disservice, right? So, right, we see that in these images, they pretty much all look like they're Caucasian, able-bodied. All of the victims look like they're female and feminine. They look younger, and the perpetrator looks like they're male. They're using a lot of physical aggression. Also notice that there seems to be resistance from the victim. And, so when we use these images a lot of times in campus campaigns around consent and sexual assault awareness month, domestic violence awareness month, right? We see these posters over and over again using these images with good intentions, because they want to highlight how terrible this issue is. But if I am a trans male survivor, or I'm a person of color, or I'm a person with disabilities, and I see this, or my situation was an acquaintance rape where that person didn't feel like they were physically holding me down, and maybe I didn't say no, and maybe I didn't cry until many days afterward, as opposed to these images where it's in the moment terrifying, then I think, I guess it didn't really happen to me. I guess it wasn't that bad. I guess I don't qualify for these services. And that is the reality of many survivors that we work with, is that they don't see themselves reflected in these conversations. And so they think that their experience is in many ways invalidated, and they don't get the help that they need. And we also don't have this bigger perception about, when we're talking about ending rape culture, all of the nuances of what that looks like. All right. So the way that I often explain rape culture is through the story we get in biology, or we used to get. I guess they stopped telling it now. Like, younger people are like, I haven't heard that one. But for many people, they've heard this growing up, right? Which is, there's a story that they used to tell in biology class, that if you put a frog in a pot of water that was room temperature, and then you very, very slowly heated it, the frog would not notice the water was getting hotter until it was boiling, because it was so slow, it was so subliminal, and then the frog would die. And then the opposite side of the story is, if you put the frog in the hot water while it's already boiling, they would immediately notice that something is wrong, and they would save themselves. They would hop out. So this is a really great analogy for rape culture, right? Which is that when you say that term, if people aren't familiar with it, they'll often have this really negative kind of knee-jerk reaction of, I don't live in a culture that's pro-rape. Like, I don't know anyone who would say that sexual assault is okay. But then we see, again, these major cases, right? Or an extreme situation come up in our community or in our world, and we think, oh my gosh, how did that happen? How was there somebody going around and preying on all of these people? How did this go on for decades? And how did they have so many victims? This seems so extreme. This seems so bizarre. Where did this come from, right? And it comes from that water, our society slowly heating up and allowing things to gradually get worse and worse and worse, because we think, well, but it's not boiling. We're not really in danger. That joke isn't that bad. That lyric in that song is, not a big deal. That message in that movie, let's not blow it out of proportion. It's just a movie. But we internalize all of these things, and they're in our conversations, and they're in the things that we tell even our young people, and what we tell each other about relationships and what consent should look like, and whether we acknowledge it at all as integral to our society. And so we let these things happen, and all of a sudden it's boiling, and we think, why didn't I notice it before? And so that's really what creating a culture of consent is about, is having that acknowledgement of all of these things that are going around us all the time and have been. And that even though, no, we most of us don't live in a society where people would say, oh yes, sexual assault is fine, that we actually are condoning it in many ways by letting that continuum of harm continue. So we see this, a great example is, cartoons, right? As young kids, we have poor Belle, who is suffering from Stockholm Syndrome and identifying with her captor, who tried to kill her father I don't know how we don't mention that, right, when we're kids. Unfortunately, more and more people have been having this conversation over the past 5 to 10 years, but still, right, a lot of people don't ever stop and think, that is not a very healthy relationship for our children to, be viewing and seeing as a happy ending. And then, another character being Pepe Le Pew, right, who is like the epitome of rape culture, but again, is sold as someone who is just romantic. He's French, he can't help it. He's just having fun. He's in love with I think he's a skunk and she's a cat. He's in love with the cat, right? And again, the problem is we see those things and we shrug our shoulders and we say, come on, it's just a cartoon, it's just a story. And again, as our young people get older, it's just a lyric, it's just a movie. Don't take it so seriously, it's not a big deal. But that is how then we end up in those situations where predatory people are allowed to flourish. And so when we talk what is sexual violence, again, just very basic overview, right? Unwanted touching, can be molestation, can be unwanted comments and jokes, harassment, unwanted sexual acts, sexual assault. And then the opposite of any kinds of these abuse systems is consent. And so I want you to think about, we don't have time to do another question, but I want you to think about, and we can talk about this when we do the group discussion at the end, what are some common consent issues that you see, right? Because when we have that heightened awareness of, wow, this is actually existing around us all the time, then the sooner we identify them, the sooner we can act to change them. And so I've seen the continuum of harm often illustrated as like a spectrum on a line, but I really like to think of it more as the pyramid. And interestingly, this week, I saw somebody was sharing a pyramid of systemic racism in the same way. And I thought that was so cool because I was like, yes, it's better if we think of it as a pyramid than a continuum along a line, because we want to think about how one thing is supporting the other, right? One thing is a building block for the next level. So we have at the bottom again, sexist jokes, homophobia, transphobia, catcalling, internalized bias, unconscious bias, right? Just those beliefs about, again, like someone mentioned, women being helpless, all victims being women, all of these things we just kind of internalize and again say, oh, well, it's not up at the top of the pyramid, so it's socially acceptable. And then in the middle, we have the things that people might kind of step back and say, like, well, that is concerning. I mean, it's not the worst, but it's concerning, right? Blackmail, revenge porn, victim blaming, manipulation, and threats, right? That's when it gets to a level where people start to get uncomfortable. But again, they might say, well, they threatened that person, but did they show up at their door? No, it's not that big of a deal. And of course, it's creating another strong foundation for the next level, which is where people actually sit up and pay attention most of the time, which is assault, rape, physical violence, right? And so again, ideally, we're identifying these behaviors at that bottom level, at that foundational level, so that they don't get a chance to grow and escalate. The impact of any of these forms of violence, and again, it's really important to not just be thinking about sexual assault, but remembering that all of these kinds of trauma across the continuum are very much valid and something that really can change us physiologically as well as emotionally, right? And I think that's so fascinating. And a lot of times when I talk about trauma, I just give this quick overview to help people understand that this is physically changing our brains when we experience any kind of acute or chronic trauma. So one of the first things it does, and it's amazing, we can actually see in MRIs the gray matter of the brain, the physical matter of the brain, shrinking and growing. So it is malleable like that. And when we experience trauma, we see that the prefrontal cortex, which is right here, will shrink. It will actually get smaller. And that is the part of the brain that allows us to regulate our feelings, allows us to calm down, to realize that things are okay. And, if things are upsetting or difficult, to work through them. So that decreases. The hippocampus also decreases, and that is our memory center. So a lot of times for survivors, they might not even remember that they lived through something for many years, if it happened in childhood, if they happened as adults. A lot of times when people ask them what happened, it's scattered. It's really hard for them to create a concrete kind of chronological timeline of exactly what occurred and when and by who, because the hippocampus is saying, this is not a good thing for us to remember. This is really bad. And so it's much easier for us to function if we scatter those memories and make it harder to bring them back into our present. So that's decreased. Again, this is physiological changes, not just perception, right? And then the amygdala increases. That's the one part that gets larger through trauma. And the amygdala is our crisis response. So that's fear, panic, hypervigilance, right? Kind of like scanning our environment, feeling like everything's against us, feeling like we're always in danger. That's heightened because the brain is saying, what we don't need right now is to regulate this emotion. What we don't need right now is to remember it. But what we do need is to try to protect ourselves from having it happen again. And so, again, when we're talking about all of these things, we're talking about rape culture and many people who have sustained trauma and all kinds of trauma, that they will then be experiencing these physical changes to the brain. And we know that sexual violence is also something that is used as a weapon of war. So in Bosnia in the 90s, a lot of people don't know this, but the way that we talk about concentration camps in World War II, there were very similar systems set up, but they were just focused on sexual violence. So they had soldiers, they had medical personnel who were running these facilities. These were houses, these were compounds where they would rape women in particular, but they also raped men and children all day long for weeks and months at a time, day and night. And so, and that was very intentional. You know, that didn't happen by accident. They created this as a system because they knew that if they did that to those people, it would break them down so much mentally and emotionally for generations. That's much more powerful than just killing someone if you want to cause them harm. And we saw the same thing, even now it's still going on. There's still conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where, again, one of the main weapons of war is sexual violence. And there's a lot of really great further reading about, especially what's going on in the Congo still at this time, and again, what people can do about it. But being aware that, you know, again, this is impacting people on the individual level, and then this is something that people use as a tactic to destroy entire communities. Because if we're impacting their brains like that, then for generations, people will be trying to recover. Now the flip side, and I know I'm talking quickly because I want to be mindful of time, and these are a lot of discussions we have to get through, but write down your questions and your thoughts so we can discuss them after. But the flip side of this is really cool. That another thing a lot of people aren't aware of that I delved into really intensely during my doctoral program in my research were rape-free cultures. So there are even evolutionary psychologists who have a platform where they believe that sexual violence is just part of human nature. It's part of evolution. Darwin even said some of that in some of his writings. And we now know through some incredible studies and really in-depth explorations of certain communities that there are rape-free cultures. There are cultures that do not have a concept of sexual assault or domestic violence. It's just not a thing. It's just not a thing. So what that tells us is that this is not part of human nature. Just like we say racism is learned, sexual violence, domestic violence is learned. So we can change that. We have the power to change that. So when anthropologists look at rape-free cultures, they found a couple commonalities. Number one, they all seem to reject toxic masculinity, right? Obviously, they wouldn't have that term necessarily, but from our point of view, when we talk about toxic masculinity and unhealthy expressions of gender that put down people and demean human beings and make people not able to express their feelings, right? They don't have any concept of that. People are really allowed to have these very healthy expressions of gender. Two, women are seen as equals, and they are very vocal in all of these communities in decision making, both in a kind of a political realm and interpersonally in their homes and in relationships. Three, and as a sexologist, you know, this is the thing that people have the hardest time digesting, especially if they're coming from a worldview and exposure that isn't comfortable with talking about sex very openly. But all of these cultures see sex as something that is not shameful, and sexual exploration and expression is very normalized. And down there we have the picture from the Krung, which is a community in Cambodia where when girls enter their teen years around 13 or 14, their parents build them a hut. The boys don't get a hut, only the girls. They build them a hut next to their home where they can go, and it's kind of like their room, like a teen room, and so they can decorate it and stay in it as they feel comfortable, and their family's right there if they need them, but it gives them a little extra space. And then it is a cultural expectation that as they want to explore their sexuality and relationships, they will invite boys that they want to bring in to come in, and they will have sexual experiences and explore what that means to them and what that looks like for them. And then if they're done, you know, it's their space. So there's not this feeling of these other people coming in and violating their space, right? But that they're invited, and then if somebody does not honor their boundaries, they tell them to leave, right? And it's amazing because they've done this for hundreds and probably thousands of years. And they are one of the cultures that has not ever experienced internally sexual assault or domestic violence. It's just not a concept that they have. So we can learn from that in the way that we approach sexuality, especially with young people, and social scripting. So what we can take from that, kind of like now making it a Western academic concept, what we can learn from the Krung is that if we want to end sexual violence, we have to promote sexual agency and sexual subjectivity. So sexual agency is the ability to make sexual choices according to one's will, free from coercion. Experiencing oneself as a sexual agent means feeling in control of one's sexual decisions and experiences. And that is from a study that was done on that, which is, again, awesome continuing reading after this. Sexual subjectivity is the entitlement to pleasure from oneself, entitlement to sexual pleasure from a partner, sexual self-efficacy in achieving sexual pleasure, and sexual self-reflection. So you get, like, if we take what those rape-free cultures have in common, this is what we can kind of look at from an academic perspective as what we could name those concepts, right? Which is that we give people from their first experiences with even their own personal sexuality coming into that power, and then navigating adolescence and young adulthood and onward as being agents in those experiences, right? Not letting that things happen to them, not letting society tell them what is or isn't right for them, but really being able to feel that they have control over that. And then additionally, being able to reflect on that experience, which is something I think, especially in our Western world, we really don't get to do a lot. We're not encouraged to say, oh, you know, how was that sexual experience for you? How do you feel about this? What emotions did that bring up? There's some areas that you want to explore differently, right? And I often ask people to stop and think for a second, looking at those definitions. What would your adolescence and young adulthood have been like, right? If you were raised in a society, in a community, in a family that promoted your personal sexual agency and subjectivity, and if that was modeled for you, if you saw other adults reflecting on these experiences and really having a very clear voice in defining what was right for them. Because we have not, as a society, made these a priority, we have these two really problematic things that occur very often. And this is again one of those things that we don't talk about enough when we talk about consent, because a lot of times we kind of want to make any concept, including consent, this like nice little neat package. And when people ask us really hard questions, we're like, oh, don't worry about that. Just watch the QT video, you know? And in some ways we do have to sometimes, you know, make things kind of more succinct. But in the end, if we, again, want to create a culture of consent, we have to talk about these harder, nuanced issues. And so we see the concept in this, these are sociological terms of token resistance and token compliance, which is the reality that we live in a society that does not promote authentic communication and that yes means yes concept. And so these things come up. So a lot of times students will say, and again, I've even seen it when there are other presenters and I'm observing them, they'll say, well, sometimes people say no, but you know, they're really saying yes, and they'll shut them down. That never happens, you're absolutely wrong. Now, conceptually, that's absolutely wrong, but what they're actually tapping into is a sexual script that we have in Western society, which is we do promote that as, especially for women, maybe not being able to say yes to what they really want, right? That there's this expectation that we should say, no, I don't really want to have sex, or I don't really want to have sex that way, because then that person will be labeled as slutty and sexually immoral or dirty, etc. Right? So they have that script of, oh, I'm supposed to resist in some way. And then that whole completely destroys our whole concept of, again, the consent culture we're trying to promote. So when somebody says no, but they authentically want to communicate yes, it's token resistance. It's the culture telling them, I'm not supposed to be able to express what I really want. When we have people who say yes, which again, we see this across all people of all genders, but especially for young men, this fear of being able to say, I'm not ready for sex, I don't want to have sex, or I want to have sex in a totally different way, that is token compliance, right? They feel like anything that's offered to them in order to be a man, they have to agree to. Or when people are in relationships, well, I'm in a relationship with this person, or I'm married to this person, I have to say yes, even though authentically I want to say no, right? So again, huge concepts. We could do many talks just on this alone, but I think it's really important for us to at least introduce. And again, here are some citations if you want to read some scholarship on both of those. So we talked a little bit at the beginning of this around colonization, right? And so we have to talk about colonization if we want to talk about consent and rape culture, because colonization is built on a culture of sexual violence. And we also have to realize that, again, even if people aren't individually experiencing sexual trauma, that their community, their family members, their ancestors, all of these people they are connected to have probably experienced it if they're part of one of those marginalized communities. And so just like we talked about in Bosnia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, how they've used sexual violence as a strategic tool to really decimate entire communities and cultures, colonization did that too, right? We can learn about any of the colonizers who came from Europe and how that was integral to their plan of taking over communities was sexual violence. And so this is one of my favorite quotes, and kind of, again, trying to understand something that's very meta, very complex, is by Patrick Wolf. And he says, colonization is a structure, not an event, right? So a lot of times we think, oh yeah, like people came over in boats hundreds of years ago, got it, it's over, it's done. It is still part of our culture, is still part of our society. And it's woven into the fabric, just like we talked about with rape culture, right? It's subliminal, it becomes part of our language, the way we approach people, the way that we label them are built on these colonized structures that are happening right now. Rape culture is embedded and reliant on colonized paradigms. So when we talk about rape culture, if we are not talking about colonization, we're not really talking about rape culture. Both seek to destroy the humanity of individuals and communities. Sexual violence has and is most prevalent in communities that have been violated by colonization. So again, when we look at those rape-free cultures and communities, they haven't been as impacted by colonization. So again, we might think, wow, why are certain communities experiencing so much sexual violence? And then we have to look at, well, how has colonization impacted them? And usually we will see a direct connection. Sexual violence includes everything from state-sanctioned rape, which again is a thing not just in those examples we talked about earlier, but is part of our nation's history, was that our government sanctioned sexual assault as a weapon to destroy the communities that we were coming into, and reproductive rights, both in forced sterilization and forced reproduction. Again, this is just barely touching on something that is so huge and has so much history and research and amazing voices talking about all of these concepts. But it's important for us to know, okay, those things happen, they are happening. And again, when we're seeing these things in the media, we think, where do they come from? Well, they've been embedded into the fabric of who we are. We cannot talk about sexual violence without talking about colonization. So then if colonization is part of all of this, we have to acknowledge, and we will not be able to get through all of these stories today. We have to have another talk on just cultural humility in violence prevention, right? But when we're talking about prevention, if you are going to every community that you are speaking to and just painting this conversation with a broad brush and not acknowledging each community's unique experience, then you're doing them a great disservice. I'll just speak to quickly my experience with the Language and Cultural Center at the University of Houston. So when I started the first sexual violence prevention program at UH, I got a call from this center, and they said, our students are not officially part of the mainstream student body because they have to pass an exam on English proficiency first. So they're international students, and they're on campus, and they're interacting with everybody, but nobody's coming and teaching them about consent or sexual misconduct or their rights or also legal boundaries, because they don't speak English fluently, and we just can't get anyone out here to talk to them. Will you come talk to them? And I said, yes, I will. And it was honestly like one of the most transformative experiences in my career. What I figured out I could do was really break down both the terminology and the concepts that I wanted to cover, and then highlight them with a script that I would read and then do a lot of interactive exercises around. But with the script, I could have it translated, and we got it translated into 11 languages, right? So if you're talking communities that you think, oh, well, we don't speak the same language, so I guess I can't teach them about consent, wrong, wrong. And it's also really cool because a couple of countries who dealt with a lot of immigrants from Syria and the Middle East during that conflict in recent years, like Norway and Denmark and Holland, they actually created consent classes for immigrant populations because they knew there would be some differences in cultural norms and expectations. And they actually saw a lot of increase in sexual violence where they were identifying those perpetrators from those communities, but instead of demonizing them, instead of saying, well, we shouldn't have immigration, they said, we need to have a conversation about where we're coming from and make it something that's applicable to their communities and their lives. So last but not least in our conversations for today is restorative justice. Oh, let's see. I thought I had some additional pieces on that slide, but we will go into the Navajo peacemaking actually, yeah. So just to touch on restorative justice first, so restorative justice, again, broad concept, but what it's really looking at is going from saying I'm sorry during any kind of misconduct, right? And this can be harassment, stalking, sexual exploitation, right? Just even like teenagers sharing pictures with somebody that they want to share that with, and then that person weaponizing it against them, right? To actual physical violence. Taking that apology that our justice system tries to create in punitive measures and making it an action, right? Making it something where people are really able to learn about the harm that they've caused, not just to that individual, but to their community and the people that have supported them, and as well hold accountable for that atonement, not just the perpetrator, but the people who supported and ignored their behaviors. So restorative justice is incredible, and it's such a powerful tool, and I've used it a lot with Title IX, so on college campuses, looking at sexual misconduct cases and saying, how can this person really learn from this experience and do better, and how can we amplify that victim's voice? And it's been very successful. So that's actually one of the programs that I'm launching this month, is an online course just on restorative justice in sexual misconduct cases, because it is so broad and complex. One of my inspirations for this is Navajo peacemaking. So Navajo peacemaking really is, when we talk about restorative justice, where we're getting it from. It's not a lot of Western judicial systems. It comes from other communities and cultures, right? So they have a very intrinsic and complex system for accountability, and again, really restoring communities and justice, because we have to always have on the forefront of our mind that these are not violations of just a person in a situation. These are violations of individuals and communities, and that's what needs to be addressed and healed. And so what makes it different than a lot of Anglo jurisprudence is that Navajo peacemaking is cooperative, not adversarial. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have a clear person that's done something wrong and a clear person that has been victimized, but it's about, again, how are we going to heal this? How is this person going to really learn how the impact of that harm, of their action, left this ripple effect in that person and their community, right? Instead of just, well, I hope I don't get in trouble. I hope I don't get sentenced to something too. Oh, well, I did. Well, maybe my lawyer can help me get it off, right? Nothing is really gleaned from that. Nothing is gained and nothing is restored. There are a lot of cultural tools. So they use things like storytelling, healing rituals, cultural terminology. So again, when we're talking to different communities and they're experiencing different kinds of violence, are we using cultural humility to utilize the tools that are already in place in that culture? The whole community becomes involved in Navajo peacemaking, which again is really, really beautiful. And part of that is that the victim and their loved ones are given a voice and reparations. So it's not just, again, here's your punishment, I hope you learn from it. Well, most people don't learn from that, right? They walk away and they say, oh, well, the system was against me. I didn't do anything that bad. They never have to really face, again, the full implications of their harm. And they don't really have to do anything to make it right? And so those reparations are sometimes monetary, and there's sometimes just other kinds of ways of giving back to that person. And when I was at the United Nations, I was the delegate for an NGO in 2016. And one of the things I observed in the United Nations was when they had people sent to war zones for war crimes, because this can be used really in almost any situation, even the most severe, they would ask the victims of each crime that they would interview, what does justice look like to you? Because they knew that person in that situation, in whatever circumstance that they were harmed, justice would look a little bit different for each of them. And so they would actually fold that into the proceedings that they had when they were prosecuting war crimes, which was amazing. Again, big concept. We're like, I want to make sure we get time for discussion because we're going to run out of time. But sometimes people use terms and then they misconstrue them and they become not helpful, right? And I've seen that with people saying, oh, we have to be victim-centric. And again, really what they end up doing is taking power away from victims, giving them less of a voice, right? We have to understand, again, everything from colonization's impact to social scripting, and understand that offenders can have a history of victimhood. A lot of people don't want to think about how people can have those conflicting identities. It depicts things as just this very black and white system instead of looking again at the systemic issues, the communities that supported those incidents of violence. And then there's no long-term solution. Okay, so they're kicked off campus. Okay, so they go to jail for a few months or a few years. What was learned from this? Was that victim, again, really heard? Do they think that this person is changed in any way? And I say this, let me always point out that I say this as a survivor myself, right? So I'm not trying to imagine what it would be like to survive interpersonal violence on an intimate level. I have lived it. And it very much informs these perspectives that I have, right? And what I want to create and what I want to see for the world. Because I know that the justice system certainly did not make me feel like anything was really done, that this person learned from what they did to me at all, right? And so that's where, as a scholar, I'm saying, what are the answers that I can dig deeper on? We also have to be aware that there are so many factors that go into offending, right? And address those in our prevention education and in our response, personal history and awareness, neurodivergence. So there's a lot of people who neurologically have a very hard time understanding these concepts of consent and need more direct instruction and examples than they're often given. Again, we talk about cultural influence and then social scripting. Restorative justice is amazing because, again, especially for victims, it gives them back a voice. It allows them to see justice through and gives them that ability to influence outcomes. So the last thing I want us to think about, right, and again, we can bring this into our discussion, is what, we've talked about all these concepts, but what is rape culture really? What does it boil down to? It boils down to this cultural concept that consent is not necessary, right? It's not required in rape culture. If it's present at all, then it might say, well, there can be consent, but it's unclear, right? And again, it's a lot of feedback from students is they'll say, well, I've heard about consent, but it seems kind of gray to me. There's even this concept called gray rape, which is, again, very much intrinsic to rape culture, where people think, oh, you know, there's not this clear distinction. The victim is always the first to be blamed. We tell victims that they're responsible for their safety, right? So there's a lot of risk reduction prevention education where they'll tell people, well, you know, don't do this, don't do that. Wear this, I can't believe it, but there's nail polish that will detect if there's drugs in your drink, or coasters that do that. And like all of that is, even though it may be well-intended, it is victim blaming. And I actually recently wrote a piece just about that, right? How, again, our intent might be good, but actually we're still feeding into that system. We might think that consent is simply a no in rape culture, and someone mentioned yes means yes. And again, we've talked about the nuance of being able to authentically communicate. And then stereotypes justify actions. So if we're thinking about all of those things, we're saying, yes, those are all very much messages I grew up with. Those are messages I see in my society, and again, our media, our movies, even in what our politicians say. Then what is the opposite of that? What is consent culture? So as we leave today, even if you don't stay for the final discussion, I want you to really think about these pieces, about what can you do with this information. Number one, to advocate for community education around all of these concepts, offer restorative justice options for your system, whatever system you're allowed to interact and work in. Then, so importantly, bring these conversations home. That means your physical home, your schools, your churches. I recently this week was contacted by someone who wants to do a church summit for all of their local congregations about consent culture and facing that as churches. So thank you for the applause, right? There's so many places these conversations have not happened. So many, right? And so you as individuals hearing this today, and I know many of you are already doing this work, it's about amplifying that, right? And finding more opportunities to bring these more complex outlooks to really change and shift paradigms around consent. And then last, but certainly not least, most importantly, you have to model it yourself. You have to live it, right? The way you interact with people, the way that you communicate with anyone in your life has to make consent paramount. And I've seen people go out and have these amazing talks, but not really walk that on a daily basis. And so that really is the first, if not the most important step. So we're going to conclude. Think about 3 things you've learned. Again, these are just kind of conversation starters. 2 things you will actionably do, and 2 things you will share with your community. All right, last slide. I'm going to share with you how to stay in touch with me. These are my websites. EquityandAgency.com is the firm. Dr. Laura McGuire, you can just find me and you can email me directly there. I also, of course, have social media. I love to connect on LinkedIn and Instagram. It's where I'm most active. I also have 2 books coming up that go way more in depth on all these conversations, right? Because I just threw like a ton of information at you. One is Creating Cultures of Consent, and that's more for the K-12 audience. That's coming out through Rowman and Littlefield Publishing. And then the Sexual Misconduct Guidebook, Consent and Conduct for Higher Education. And that will be coming out later this year through Stylus Publishing. All right, let's begin the discussion.
Love it. Oh my God. Well, let's first of all give everyone a virtual round of applause for Dr. McGuire. Thank you. So we have some questions already in the chat box that I will get started to share with you. But with everyone else, if you have any questions, now is your time. So there were a couple of questions about the Cambodian culture that you talked about. The name of it, and also if there's other examples, and also if you know anything about if they practice safe sex.
So, okay, so I'm going to put in the chat box for everyone the name. They are the Krung. They are in Cambodia. There are other examples. The scholarship I would read on that is mostly by Dr. Peggy Sanday. I'm putting that in the chat box too. She's the anthropologist who is most famous for publishing just a ton of work through many decades on rape-free cultures in particular. And she has a book on how she takes those lessons and how she would visualize that being applied to college campuses. Really cool stuff. And again, huge inspiration for my work. So the Krung in Cambodia, yes, that's a common question people get. Well, like what happens? What happens if somebody gets pregnant? Now, in their community, that's a great question. I do not know what their religion is. I would imagine that it's, again, an indigenous religion, like what we conceptualize around like paganism, right? But they for a long time didn't have any real outside interaction on an intimate level. So the STDs were not an issue as far as I've been able to read in any of the research done on them. They did have unplanned pregnancies, but culturally, because again, they so normalized sexuality, they never saw that as an issue. And it was actually very culturally acceptable to get pregnant by someone when you were young and then raise that child and children with someone else that you chose as a life partner later on. So again, where we're like, whoa, how could this possibly be applied? It's because we have so many structures around sexual shame, right? And again, even like who we reproduce with and who we raise children with and all these things. And they just don't have that. So a rape-free culture doesn't have any of those issues. And people have also said to me, oh, well, what about the rest of their life? What about their healthcare? No, nothing's perfect, right? And it doesn't mean that we have to now go and try to live exactly like a Cambodian tribal community. We can't do that for most of us. But what we can do is we can take what has been working, right? And we can say, how do we apply that to our own communities? Because there are lessons from that we can apply.
Awesome. So I see 2 more questions at the moment. One is from Megan. What is the best way to get involved in further trainings around consent and rape culture?
Yeah. I would definitely say reach out to me because, it really depends on what exactly further information you're looking for, right? I always have lots of resources. I'm trying to create this summer. I have like dedicated myself, especially with the lessons from COVID, about creating more online courses for people that they can just like access and, you know, really go on a deeper dive with each specific topic. But if there's a conversation that, you know, you want brought to your community, I go all over the world. So wherever you are, I can also usually get there. So yeah, just reach out to me.
That's awesome. Another question, perhaps the last question, so keep the questions coming. Can you get images of the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and amygdala from an MRI?
Yes. So right, that there are neuropsychologists, right, and they have some great imagery where you can actually again see some of those changes. I think I'm not sure if I cited them on this, but I have the citations for the research. Again, I'm an academic person. I go to so many talks and people just like spout out facts, and I'm like, where is this coming from? You know, I want to read the study and I want to make sure like there were good metrics used and all that stuff. So again, you can reach out to me and say like, hey, can I read some of those studies on those actual physical changes to the gray matter of the brain, and I will send them your way.
I see another question about experts on childhood sex trafficking, and someone also responded with cultureframed.org and Dr. Gail Dines.
Okay. All right, so let's see. So experts on childhood sex trafficking. I know a couple of nonprofits and experts who focus on that. That's not a focus of my scholarship, but I can definitely, again, connect you to some of those folks. I'd have to look up their website. Again, if you email me there, I will connect you with people that I know that work specifically in the trafficking field. Definitely.
Awesome. And then I see we have another question from Gabrielle. I'm thinking about the other contexts for which a rape-free culture you described. If we're working towards sexual agency and sexual subjectivity, but we're missing the component of gender equity and have other systemic factors like racism affecting power balances, how does that complicate the work of replicating what works in rape-free communities? Excellent question, Gabrielle. Thank you.
Yes, yes. And, you know, again, that's what it comes down to is we don't see these as separate issues, right? And so many times people will just say, oh, well, this is this incidence or this is this issue, and they won't talk about the intersectionality of all of the others, right? Because they're all based on structural inequality, all of them. And so, yes, for those communities, again, they're small. They don't have to deal with the complexities that we deal with. But, you know, we really can stop and say, well, what can we borrow from them? And then how do we address how all of these kinds of systemic oppression intersect, right? And I think by addressing that, we are working towards creating that consent culture, but we can't do it in a vacuum, and we can't do it just by talking about one issue as if it's not connected to the others.
That also reminds me of the concept you were talking about of token
resistance and compliance.
Yeah, where someone could say yes, but they don't mean it. And I think that we have to be aware of how structural racism and power can impact those decisions specifically, like you were saying. And I see that Lauren also is adding to this conversation that trauma doesn't need to be sexual to impact sexual agency, which I feel like that needs to be on like an Instagram graphic to be like shared widely, because that's well put.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, like when I talk about just do like sessions on trauma alone, I list so many kinds of trauma because again, people usually think like, oh, physical abuse or sexual abuse. Again, communal, complex, secondary, vicarious, medical. I mean, you can go on and on and on, and all of those cause those brain structures to shift. Let me also say about when we talk about the negative, harmful impacts of trauma on the brain. Again, the brain is very malleable. And so with intentional healing, with therapy, with meditation, with whatever kind of modality works for you, the brain also can go back to kind of that ideal state, right? We can see it physically healing itself. So I think I try to be very cautious and intentional that, when we talk about how serious this is, it's not saying, oh, well, and then survivors are just stuck that way, or, there's something they can do about that. They can absolutely heal, and the brain wants to heal. So you can work with it and do that.
That's an amazing thing that we are not defined by our trauma also, and that we are not helpless, in a way that there are active things that we can do to help ourselves and to heal ourselves. And if there was ever a time to think about actively practicing healing, I think right now is 100% that time. Because as a nation, we're all going through, I think, some sorts of trauma, obviously some of us more than others. But I see a couple more questions coming in related to that. One from Megan in Kentucky about asking for resources centered around healing the traumatized brain.
Yes. Okay. So there's so many different kinds of resources because there's so many different things that work for different people, right? There's just definitely not that one size fits all, like this therapy is. And in the work that I do, there's definitely people who promote that, right? Like I have the secret method that heals all survivors in 24 hours. Seriously, I've seen those things. Remind people not to buy into that, right? What works for them is going to be very, very different. And also, again, dependent on their intersectional identities. Like one thing that I do a lot with survivors, and I've started training other people to do around the country, is trauma-informed yoga. Because again, I have a yoga background, and that's really based on somatic theory, which is the belief that, and again, very much based on research, that we not only store trauma in our brain, but we store it throughout the body. And allowing people to identify that and release it and work through it can, again, really be part of that whole body and mind healing. So that's something that I do and I have a lot of experience with. But, there's so many, and even like when we talk about Navajo peacemaking, right? Cultures have healing modalities that are unique to them. So I would encourage people to tap into those resources because they're out there.
Oops. Oh, I see one last, perhaps, question from Karen about asking you to talk about how you manage the dynamic of talking to young cis men about gender-based violence. They often find it's really tricky to not get them offside from the beginning when talking about rape culture, even when degendering the language, for example. Often they already come into a session defensive or resistant and full of the mythology and increasingly MRA ideology. I'll admit, I don't remember what MRA stands for, but
is it men's rights activists or something? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, right. So they are hearing these conversations about, oh, this is painting all men as rapists. And, and again, the tough questions we get, it's easy to be defensive and be like, no, that is not the message. That is not true. Are there prevention educators who have gone out and said, she for the victim and he for the perpetrator? Yeah, that's been a thing. And so we do have to talk about that. We do have to be honest about that and say, sometimes we have painted this in this monolith, and that's not good, and that didn't help anyone. And so I think up front, address it, right? Always address the elephant in any room. Don't shy away from it. Don't try to pretend like it doesn't exist or cover it over, excuse it away. Say, this is really hard. This is not what we're going for. And I think, the most important thing that I've seen, especially with working with young cis men, is focus on what we do want to create, right? And versus focusing on like horror stories and how widespread sexual assault is, right? It's not that there isn't a place and time for that, but if that's what we're always leading with in prevention and consent, yeah, people are going to turn off from that. What they want to hear more is, here's how it benefits everybody to have a consensual relationship. And when I work with young cis men who are offenders, right, and again, who've often had more minor offenses, but when I work with them in restorative justice programs, they'll say to me, what's going on with our culture and consent and how I interact with women doesn't work for me. Like, I feel gross. I don't like this. I feel like I'm always chasing women and like they don't actually like me, but that's all I've got. That's what I was taught by my dad. So I was taught from my friends. And so people are hungry for the alternative. And I think if we focus on that, you get a lot more people to get on board.
I love it. I'm going to share two resources from Kimberly in Newton. One is that she was saying that she trains as belly dance as healing dance with Lorraine Lafta in Massachusetts. So shout out to all the people in the New England who can do this. And she recommends you Google dance kinetics, or NIA, which is neuromuscular integrative action. Also, she suggested another resource in Boston, Massachusetts that I want folks to know about who are here. The Boston Area Rape Crisis Center does do free presentations on consent. Present trainings is a new word I'm saying. So BARCC.org is their website. Thank you, Kim, for bringing that up. We're going to be hearing from BARC, in fact, at our next webinar in a couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that, everyone. And then Kimberly from Florida has asked a great question, perhaps to end on, I think, because it's about taking action. It's about, this is the education that we need as feminists to create a feminist democracy. But we also know as now members that legislation is also key towards ensuring a feminist democracy and world free of rape culture. So Dr. McGuire, would you tell us about the bill that you have written for Florida so that we can all think about how we can ensure consent legally within our states?
Yes. So that's again, one of the areas I've been really trying to move on is getting all of these conversations to become supported by state legislators. And so we did have a bill that my firm wrote, and it did go in front of the Florida House of Representatives, but they ended up saying there wasn't a budget to hear it further. But we're going to keep doing it. We're going to keep pushing this. And so I think, whether you live in Florida and you'd love to support that, that's something we'll be doing, especially in the fall this year, and then again in the spring probably. But if that's something that you want support on to bring to your state, know that states budget for programs. They budget to support both mandates for laws to be changed, like defining consent, which a lot of states don't have, but also for paying nonprofits and individuals to go out and do these programs throughout their community. And, again, that funding's out there and it's going somewhere. So it should go to consent education. Right. So I think getting politically involved, finding out if anyone's doing that, and if they're not, figuring out who you can connect with to write those bills is both powerful and important.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. McGuire. Let's give her another round of applause virtually from all over the country. We are sending you so much love and are so thankful for you putting this presentation together for us, because we need to be centering consent and learning how to practice consent, even as feminists right now, while we are in this pandemic so that we are not returning to the old normal, but as we are broadly thinking about how to create the new normal, we are centering this conversation. So thank you everyone from coming from all over the country. Please go to now.org, sign up to become a member and join your local chapter. And this webinar will be on MassNow's YouTube page. So I'll send you a link to it with a link for feedback so that you can share this education with any angry feminists, you know. So thank you all.
Thank you.